It looks like the Biden administration has just failed in its execution of its own plan.
We are trying to talk to the Taliban leaders in a peaceful, brotherly, and patriotic way to solve the problems of Afghanistan.
What we want to do is make sure that we as the UK pull together our international partners, our like-minded partners, so that we deal with that regime in a concerted way.
This is manifestly not Saigon.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance, early edition with Francine Lacqua.
Good morning and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition on this Monday, the 16th of August. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London, and here's what's coming up on today's program. The Taliban take Kabul. The group marches into the Afghan capital, seizing control of the presidential palace. The new leaders will soon declare the nation the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. American-backed Afghan President Ashraf Ghani flees the country. Chaos ensues at Kabul airport as foreign nationals and panicked citizens try to leave. And the UN Security Council convenes an urgent meeting today as U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken declares this is not Saigon. Russia criticizes Washington's latest historical experiment. So there is quite a lot to do in foreign policy and to talk about. There is also quite a lot to talk about in the markets. Now, there's definitely a risk-off mood, which we're seeing play across the board, not only in U.S. futures, but also right here where stock markets are falling as traders awaiting some Fed signals. We just also spoke to our Eddie van der Walt. Again, he was telling us because of the very, very thin volumes in the month of August, especially on August 19th, which, lo and behold, is today, we could see a lot of these price swings actually being exacerbated. Now, thousands of Afghan civilians stormed Kabul airport after the Taliban take control of the capital. The Islamic group marched into the Afghan capital at the weekend, taking control of the presidential palace. American-backed President Ashraf Ghani fled the country hours earlier. The new leaders say they will soon declare the nation the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. Well, joining us now with the latest is Eltaf Nayaziveda, Bloomberg's Afghanistan reporter. Thank you for joining us. So first of all, after the Taliban takeover of the presidential palace, what could their next move be? How bloody or how peaceful can this transition be? I think we're having a couple of difficulty actually getting to our reporter on the ground. We'll get back to Eltaf very shortly. Now, we also have, of course, international perspective. The speed of the Afghan government's collapse has shocked NATO allies and has prompted questions over how President Joe Biden appeared to be blindsided by the Taliban's easy advance. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has defended the U.S. administration's decision to withdraw troops.
This is manifestly not Saigon. The fact of the matter is this. We went to Afghanistan 20 years ago with one mission in mind, and that was to deal with the people who attacked us on 9/11. And that mission has been successful.
So joining us now is Bloomberg's international government executive editor, Ross Matheson. Ross, first of all, what does this mean for foreign policy across the board? We'll get back to exactly what's happening in Afghanistan today. But could you see Iran trying to take advantage of it? Could you take, China saying the U.S. is distracted, they're weak at the moment, we will also make a move?
Well, certainly you're seeing big powers maneuvering quickly in the wake of this in a number of different ways, as you mentioned. On the one hand, China and Russia will never miss the opportunity to criticize the U.S. for something, and they're certainly enjoying that moment now. Equally, they're saying that they will probably engage with the Taliban further. The concern really for countries from Russia to China to Turkey and Iran, and including the U.S., is a shared one, and that is, does what is happening now in Afghanistan bleed outside the country into the region? Do you get a refugee crisis that funnels all the way into Europe, for example, and in that, do you get some Islamic militancy that spirals out of the country and causes difficulty for countries like China in the region? Of course, China is very sensitive to the idea of Uyghur separatists coming into their country and causing trouble. So what you're going to see is a collective desire to contain what they would probably say is the problem to Afghanistan itself. And as long as it stays there, you might see that those big powers will be willing to tolerate the Taliban running the country, just saying, don't let your issues come outside for the rest of us. Of course, for the U.S., the key thing is whether the Taliban now allow outfits like al-Qaeda to come back and train and operate. And do we see, again, that militancy spread out into the rest of the world?
Eltaf, let's go back also to Kabul and actually Eltaf, who's in Afghanistan for us. What exactly? So we know the Taliban have taken the presidential palace. We know that the president has actually fled. What will be the Taliban's next move?
The Taliban's next move is to declare the new administrations anytime sooner, perhaps today or in the coming week. They are in the process of creating their new administration. The Taliban's deputy leader, Mullah Baradar, is in Doha, and they have been negotiating within their own fighters and colleagues in Doha in order to how to create a new administration in Afghanistan. So the things are getting worse in Afghanistan now. People are rushing toward the international airport in order to exit the country. It's been chaotic since the Taliban took over the country.
Eltaf, what I still can't really understand, and I know that you've had a number of security experts try to explain it, is how is it possible for the Taliban to really take over the whole of the country, including Kabul, in such a short amount of space? Do they have the support of the Afghani people?
Well, the Taliban, they have been able to take over the country within just 2 weeks. Without any, actually with little resistance from the Afghan forces from all over the country, because the Taliban, they had been captured. They had captured a lot of districts in Afghanistan, which is nearby the cities, and they managed to break into the cities. So the Afghan forces, which were telling me they were told by the leadership in Kabul to hand over their bases to the Taliban because they knew the Taliban were coming to Afghanistan and take over the leadership, take over the country. So that's why they just handed over some of their bases to the Taliban without any fight. So that was an attempt to prevent more casualties between Afghans fighting each other in the country.
Roz, when you look at what the West can do, I know there's headlines all over the world, including some of the UK headlines saying, what did our armed service men actually die for if after 20 years it's to give it back to the Taliban? But Roz, is there something that actually the UN Security Council and NATO can do today?
Well, at this stage, there's probably very little they can do. It's unclear whether, even if the UN Security Council meets, whether Russia and China would support certain actions by the Council. What you'll probably see is countries being willing not just to bring in Afghan interpreters and contractors who worked for their militaries for many years, but also people in general allowing, like Canada, for example, saying they'll encourage people to come to Canada and settle there. That, of course, leaves a lot of desperate people still in Kabul at the moment, but there's not much the US and other countries can do aside from allowing and supporting people to come out. In terms of the military, it's very clear, as you were saying and Eltaf was saying, that the US and other countries have no interest in sustaining their troops there for an extended period beyond the evacuations that we're seeing now. And of course, there's nothing really left to sanction an economy that is so desperate as Afghanistan's and is not actually that entrenched in the rest of the global economy. You could see the IMF and the World Bank perhaps penalised with some funds that may no longer come in. But the solutions from the West at this point are very limited.
Roz, thank you so much. Roz Matheson, of course, will have Roz on throughout the day. Bloomberg's international government executive editor and also our Afghanistan reporter, Eltaf Naya-Vizeda. Now, coming up, China's economic activity slowed more than expected. New virus outbreaks add risks to a recovery already hit by floods and faltering global demand. We discuss that next. This is Bloomberg. Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, new outbreaks of the coronavirus contributed to China's economic activity slowing more than expected in July. The effects were compounded by floods and faltering global demand, while retail sales, industrial output, and fixed asset investments also all missed estimates. Now we're joined by Sheila Patel, Vice Chairman of B Capital Group, formerly Chair of Goldman Sachs Asset Management. Her new fund invests in growth stage B2B companies and founders with a focus on innovation. Now in April 2021, they also formally launched in China, focusing on technology companies. And Sheila, thank you so much for joining us today. I've been looking forward to the interview all month because I know you're a true expert on China and some of the inners and outers of the country. So first of all, Sheila, when you look at what China's trying to do in terms of regulation, but this can be actually on insurance companies, it's touching almost everything that the consumer does and looks at. Is the West actually too concerned about how far-reaching the regulation could be, for example, on technology stocks, or is there a real shift in the Chinese way of doing things?
Well, Francine, it's great to see you again and to get to have a chat. You know, when I look at China and when we think about investing in China, I think you have to take regulatory action as part and parcel of dealing in a growing economy, the same as you would expect in the US and actually the same as we've seen in Europe. Much of the actions in China are centered around data and, as you mentioned, consumer technology. And I think we are cautious in those areas, thinking that the concern over data is a global one, actually. You see countries reacting in very different ways, but consistently trying to regulate and take action in industries that are touching that particular issue more. That said, we really see so much innovation in China, particularly in the enterprise space, and so much opportunity. We think it's a great time to think critically about the next stage of growth there.
So, Sheila, if you look at exactly what China's going through at the moment with the resurgence of the Delta variant, but also very, I guess, heavy-handed lockdowns compared to other countries, certainly here in the West, does it mean that growth is a concern right now, or actually PBOC or whatever, authority it needs to do, they'll have a handle on it?
I think they'll keep a close eye on growth. I think history has shown us that China is very much aware of what's going on from the economic perspective at the same time as they take actions on a health perspective. I'd also say from having lived for many years in Asia, twice having lived through some pretty significant health issues before COVID, it's very concerning and always taken very seriously in Asian countries, including China. And I'm not surprised to see quick action being taken in the hope of staving off a long, drawn-out, protracted battle.
How do you look at the supply chain issues? I know a couple of ports, and we'll get back to technology in a second, but the third largest port in the world has been closed off. How does China actually react in these kind of situations?
Well, I think supply chain is a global challenge. And I think that's one where China, along with many other countries around the world, will have a bit of a struggle. When you look at the delays and the challenges that COVID has thrown up, the shipping delays, the manufacturing delays, just the delays in the chip industry alone and what that's meant, for example, to US automakers, there is a lot to work through that will take some time, that will impact everybody, including China.
Sheila, I know you're focusing on fintech, insurtech, industrial transportation, but also biotech and healthcare. Is there one of these that has yet to be fully disrupted?
Look, I think there's room for disruption in all of them. I think what we really see is, as you look at sometimes the areas maybe that aren't on front of mind as people think about technology, of course, people think about the technology they interact with day to day from a consumer perspective. But the backbone and infrastructure of so many industries and so many sectors needs to be revitalized. We saw that with healthcare and COVID. We made leapfrogs in terms of telemedicine and research that had to go on, even though patients weren't accessible in person in the same way. And so we've seen some of our companies like Evidation that works in the space of doing research, but being able to do it remotely, so their clinical trials and research isn't interrupted. This is where the world is headed.
And has it been accelerated because of COVID, or do you think it's actually taken a different trajectory?
I think it's accelerated. I think people have come to realize there are additional ways in which technology can help them. Take something as mundane sounding as contract lifecycle management. one of our portfolio companies, Icertis, has digitized this and tried to make this consistent for companies that in many cases were negotiating multiple contracts separately. You get to COVID, you have an emergency such as this pandemic has been, and you need to quickly be able to draw out what do contractors and vendors owe you and what do you owe them. Really hard to do if you don't have a systematized way to pull that data. So these are the kind of things that I think emerged during the pandemic that are now giving rise to great new enterprise ideas and businesses.
Sheila, thank you so much. Sheila Patel from B Capital Group stays with us, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of these thematic investing with B Capital's Sheila Patel very shortly. This is Bloomberg. Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now let's talk about investment strategy. B Capital has more than $3.5 billion in assets under management and is invested in over 90 early and growth stage companies. It believes that after 2 decades following the rise of the consumer internet, well, the next 2 will be about the digital transformation of traditional industries such as healthcare, banking, insurance, and industrials. Well, Sheila Patel is still with us. Sheila, the impact, and we're talking a little bit at the end of the interview in the last segment, but the impact of COVID-19, does it just bring more disruption or does it accelerate the trend that was already there?
I think it accelerates trends that were already there. I do think, though, it also brings to the forefront things that maybe people didn't pay as much attention to before. There's a lot more focus on how people are able to work, on whether they'll be able to remote work, on some of the infrastructure they would need to have that be functional for companies. And so as you think about enterprise, as you think broadly about the way businesses work, there's a lot of room for innovation and technology to help people get the most out of their work and home life holistically.
So one of the questions that we almost ask ourselves every day, apart from inflation and whether inflation is transitory, is what do cryptocurrencies become? What kind of work are you doing around that space?
We're doing quite a bit of work around crypto, particularly, again, thinking about the backbone of it. It's one thing to try to think about the investment side, of course, and to determine where they're going. But as you see more institutions, as you see heavy retail trading, we've found businesses such as one business we're invested in called FalconX that are really about the trading platforms and the standardization of the way that people are able to access investments in crypto. So to us, this is another place where the infrastructure needs to catch up with the interest.
Mm-hmm. So the infrastructure as in how you build it or actually how you trade it? I mean, if you talk about infrastructure and cryptocurrencies, I guess you could almost start from the beginning. Yeah,
you can almost start from the beginning. And actually, you know, I think from many years of you and I chatting, we've had lots of discussions about trading equities, trading fixed income, how people were trading ETFs, the evolution of so many markets. And when you think about that, it's almost as if the structures, the strategies, those have to evolve in parallel with the underlying platforms. And so as we look at that, we look at the platform side and the digitization side of giving access to the trading platforms and efficiency of those markets from a global perspective as being critical to having crypto really maintain its position or grow its position as something that people want to own and trade in for the long term, particularly on the institutional side.
Sheila, what about sustainability? So do you invest in renewable companies, or again, is there, if you talk, for example, about the power grid or some of the electric, cars and vehicles, you have to build an infrastructure again around it.
Absolutely. And I think, sustainability and ESG principles are something that we see woven through quite a bit of what we're doing. In fact, as you think about improving infrastructure, we had mentioned healthcare for sure. That's a place where healthcare inequalities can be addressed to some extent through technology, through access to information, through access to better care, regardless of location. And that's something telemedicine has brought us, but also data standardization, like Innovacor, a company that's a portfolio company for us, that's working on data standardization and data access so that patient records can be freely used across multiple platforms and multiple venues. These are the kind of things that really can take the S, the E, the G, and really bring them together to create more viable, sustainable businesses, but actually create value for society as well.
Sheila, thank you so much. Sheila Patel, there, Vice Chairman of B Capital Group, joining us this morning. Now, coming up, the Taliban take over the presidential palace, the rapid advance of the militant strips peace negotiators in Doha of leverage. We'll discuss that latest next. Plus, if you look at equity markets, so it's very clear that U.S. futures are falling. Stocks here in Europe are also under pressure. This is as we see more and more signs of faltering growth, also more investor nervousness in the run-up to the Jackson Hole Symposium in late August. Investors really awaiting the town hall by Jay Powell on Tuesday for clues on whether a recent string of strong economic data qualified as adequate progress for the central bank to consider tapering. This is Bloomberg. The Taliban take Kabul. The group marches into the Afghan capital, seizing control of the presidential palace. The new leaders will soon declare the nation the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. American-backed Afghan President Ashraf Ghani flees the country. Chaos ensues at Kabul airport as foreign nationals and panicked citizens try to leave. And the UN Security Council convenes an urgent meeting today as U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken declares this is not Saigon. Russia criticizes Washington's latest historical experiment. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London, and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition on this Monday, the 16th of August. Now, thousands of Afghan civilians storm Kabul airport after the Taliban take control of the capital. The militant group marched into the Afghan capital at the weekend, taking control of the presidential palace. Well, earlier we spoke with Tobias Ellwood, chairman of the UK Parliament Defence Select Committee.
The West should hang its head in shame as we abruptly abandon Afghanistan to what will now be a civil war after 2 decades of effort.
Well, Bloomberg opinion foreign affairs columnist Bobby Gosh joins us now. Bobby, I mean, it's absolutely incredible, the advancement of the Taliban at such speed. So what's the current situation on the ground in Kabul right now?
Well, Kabul has fallen for all practical purposes. The Afghans are voting with their feet by trying to get out those who can off the capital, and those who can't are basically living in fear and uncertainty. The Taliban is in possession of the presidential palace, and that completes their basic rout of most of the forces of the Afghan government. There may be a few pockets of resistance here and there, but it seems at this moment that for all practical purposes, Afghanistan is once again under Taliban control.
Bobby, what do we know about how the Taliban will actually govern?
Well, we know that nothing they say can be trusted or relied upon. They have turned back on their word several times, even in the last few days, having once said that several times said that they would not enter the capital. They have done so. So we can't go on their word. We have to go on their record, and their record, even though it is 20 years old, is fairly clear, pretty consistent, and does not allow for any kind of optimism for the Afghan people. I think the Taliban will rule as they did before, which is with maximum brutality, minimum tolerance for any dissenting opinion, and adhering to their particular vision of how a state should be governed, which is better suited for several centuries ago than the 21st.
No. Bobby Gosh, what does it also mean for terrorism? So what do we know about the relationship between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda? And if this is, an ungoverned state that goes into a civil war, what actually comes out of it in 3-4 years?
Well, I think, again, the Taliban has claimed once every so often that it is not tied to any terrorist group. We know from factual reporting that is not true, that elements of Al-Qaeda remain in the country, and now there's a very large contingent of the Islamic State, as well as other terrorist groups which enjoy not only Taliban support but also Pakistani support. And I think all these groups will grow and expand and have the room to do so, whether or not there's a civil war. If there's a civil war, then the Taliban government will have that excuse. It'll say that, look, we're busy with the civil war, we can't deal with all these terrorist groups. But even if there is no civil war, if all Afghan government forces collapse and the Taliban is in complete control of the country, they are ideologically close to these terrorist groups. They have continued to remain in contact, and they have continued to support these groups even through the greatest moment of their own distress for the Taliban. So I see no reason why that will change. I think the world is going to be a much more dangerous place, not just the immediate neighborhood of Afghanistan, but the wider world.
Bobby, thank you so much. Bloomberg Opinion Foreign Affairs columnist there, Bobby Gosh. Now, we're also joined by Elisabeth Braw, resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Elisabeth, I mean, first of all, it's absolutely incredible the advancement that the Taliban have done, which really blindsided not only the Americans, not only the British, but it seems every NATO ally. Is there anything today that the UN Security Council can actually do?
Not very much, I'm afraid, and I don't think it was a complete surprise. As many of your viewers will know, European allies of the US in NATO and indeed outside NATO were very unhappy by this decision by the Americans to withdraw, because of course that meant that they would have to withdraw too, and they suspected that something like this would happen, even though they may not have expected it to happen so quickly. But the result is, of course, that many of these countries will face the immediate consequences of the collapse of Afghanistan, whereas the US, being geographically isolated, won't face the same consequences. So it's, I think, a very unhappy situation within NATO at the moment, and between the US and its wider allies in the world.
Elisabeth, what about the funding of the Taliban? Is there, I mean, first of all, why was it not cut off in the 20 years where actually the US was present in Afghanistan? And is there anything that can be done on that front?
That is really tricky. So the US is often accused of trying to be a global police, and people resent it for it. Its friends and foes resent it for it. So it would be very difficult for the US now, and of course was in the past, to try to get off funding, because that means telling other countries that they can't spend their money as they like. Including countries such as Pakistan, that has been a sort of a frenemy of the US for many, many years, and has resented being told by the US what to do. So it is really, really difficult. And of course, Biden decided that the US should cut its losses. But again, the US itself doesn't have to face the most severe consequences of that. Afghanistan, or ordinary Afghans, are facing the consequences. Afghanistan's neighbors are facing the consequences, and Americans, European allies, will face consequences as a consequence. We will face consequences as a result of this as well.
Do we know how much support actually the Taliban get in the country? Because if the advancing of the Taliban was in just under 2.5 weeks, does it mean that actually a lot of the military joined them? Does it mean that citizens also supported them?
Well, what appears to have happened is that the Taliban played a very clever divide and conquer strategy, or tactic, really, where mayors, where local commanders of the Afghan security forces were essentially told, well, if you give up resistance to our advance, then we won't go after you personally. So they sort of picked them off one by one, and so what the reality turned out to be that almost nobody had any loyalty to the Afghan government, including the Afghan security forces. So what we have now is the complete meltdown of the Afghan state that had been built up so painstakingly over the past 20 years, not least by the Americans. And I think the fundamental misjudgment that the Americans made was believing too much in their Afghan allies. They had worked with them so closely for many years and felt they were making good progress, and they maybe got too enthusiastic and too hopeful about what those Afghans could do.
Elisabeth, when you look at some of, I guess, the fallout, first of all, for President Biden and the people around him, I mean, is there anything that he can actually do to focus the situation away from this? And does it mean that we could see an Iran trying to take advantage of a weakened U.S.? Could we see China also taking advantage?
China is already taking advantage of the situation. We have seen them positioning themselves very strongly vis-a-vis Afghanistan. They have made high-level contact with the Taliban. They did so even before this weekend. They are essentially communicating to the world that they are the key international contact of this new Taliban regime. But what it also, so going back to your question of what Biden can do now, I think the one issue that unites most of the world is China's advance as a global power, and not a single country really likes it, and there is bipartisan concern in Washington about China's role in the world and how it's exploiting that role. So I think that's the one issue where Biden can try to focus both sides of the aisle in Washington and U.S. allies in NATO and beyond NATO, because it is an immediate and very serious concern in all these quarters.
Elisabeth, thank you so much. Elisabeth Braw, their resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, joining us this morning. Coming up, the latest on Saudi Aramco, as Bloomberg sources say the energy giant is in advanced talks to buy a stake in Reliance Industries' refining and chemicals business. This is Bloomberg. Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now let's get straight to the Bloomberg First Word News. Here's Laura Wright. Hi, Laura.
Hi, Francine. Hopes are fading that the world will ever reach herd immunity for COVID-19. The original thinking was that the pandemic would fade when around 60 to 70% of the population were vaccinated. But new variants like Delta are moving the goalposts to impossibly high levels. The director of vaccine research at the Mayo Clinic says even a vaccination rate of 95% wouldn't be enough. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has called an election for next month. Polls show his Liberal Party has a large enough lead to retake a majority. Since 2019, he's needed the help of other parties to pass legislation. Half of Canadians believe his government has done a good job of managing the pandemic. Nearly 1,300 people have now died as a result of a massive earthquake off the coast of Haiti on Saturday. The U.S. has deployed search and rescue teams to help find survivors among the debris of collapsed homes, churches and hospitals. Tropical storm Grace is set to hit the nation today. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. This is Bloomberg. Francine.
Laura, thanks so much. Laura, right there. Now let's get to a Bloomberg scoop, and we've learned that Saudi Aramco is in advanced talks to acquire a stake in Reliance Industries' oil refining and chemicals business. Sources say Aramco may buy a roughly 20% stake in the Reliance unit for about $20 to $25 billion of Aramco stock. Let's get more now from our Bloomberg Middle East energy reporter, Anthony Di Paola, who helped break the story. So, Anthony, what are the details of the deal, and actually what's in it for both companies?
Hi, Francine. This would be a huge deal for two major industrial giants in the oil and refining industry. There would be major cross holdings between the two of them. As you said, it's going to be, it's proposed as an all-stock deal whereby Reliance would take shares in Aramco about 1%, according to the current share value for Aramco, about 1% in the Saudi state oil company. and Aramco then would get about 20% in Reliance, and so that would be in the oil refining and petrochemicals unit of Reliance that they are spinning off. So this would be a big deal. It's been in the works for about 2 years now. Both companies have said they're in talks, they're working on it, they're in due diligence. Things got slowed down by the coronavirus, but earlier this year, we saw the Aramco chairman even nominated to the board, named to the board of Reliance. So that's a sign that things are moving forward. And for both of these companies, really, it's about access to markets and crude oil. Reliance has one of the world's biggest refineries at Jamnagar in India, and that would give them access to a steady supply of Saudi crude. And for the Saudis, they get a guaranteed buyer for some of that oil, and that's really what they're looking at as we get into the energy transition, as we start to move away from oil demand. Yes, Francine.
Yeah, I was going to ask you actually about the energy transition. How does it fit into all of this?
The Saudis are looking down the road for when we're using less oil for driving, for gasoline, for diesel, and they're really looking big into the petrochemical space. They're looking at that market for plastics, for our computers, for our cell phones, for lightweight components, even for electric cars. And they see this as a continued outlet for their crude and continued guaranteed demand. So they're really looking at that. For Reliance, they're spinning off this energy unit, the refining and petrochemicals business, and they'll split that off from things like telecommunications and like some of their other industrial units. So for them, it's also kind of breaking up the conglomerate and moving that company forward as well too. So elements of the energy transition for both of these companies in there, Francine.
Anthony, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Anthony DiPaolo there with this important story on Saudi Aramco. Now, coming up, the global crypto market retakes a $2 trillion market cap. Much more on the price action, Bitcoin, and FX markets next. We'll be speaking to Jane Foley of Rabobank. This is Bloomberg. Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, we've seen some risk-off sentiment in global equities amid fears over the Delta variant, and that's coming through the commodity-dependent currencies. Here's some weakness in the Aussie and Canadian dollars, investors assessing risks to the demand outlook. We're also joined by Jane Foley, head of FX strategy at Rabobank. Jane, I want to talk to you about crypto, but first, if you look at some of the intensive, rich commodity currencies, how will they likely move on the back of what we heard from China today?
Well, certainly if we look at the performers in the G10, it's the safe havens really on the front foot, and it is the commodity currencies are on the rear foot. Now, if we look at the worst performer, it is the Australian dollar over a one-day view. And clearly the slower, or the signs of slower growth in China is a significant concern. They are, of course, the world's largest consumer of a huge range of commodities, but there are, of course, a number of particular domestic factors in all of the commodity currencies. For instance, the election in Canada, a Norges Bank interest rate meeting this week. But Australia, we really do have the concerns about coronavirus there too. One headline from the New South Wales Premier warning that the number of cases could go up to 1,000 a day by September. Now, that's a big turnaround for a country that appeared to have stamped out the virus just a few months ago. So coronavirus, fears of lockdowns, that is something that's weighing. And that really is confirming really the really dovish tone of the RBA. Many people were pushing against that a few months ago. Now people are thinking, well, actually, they could have even been even more dovish at their last meeting.
Jane, I have a couple of foreign policy questions, but I'm not 100% sure they actually translate into your world. First of all, Malaysia, we know the Prime Minister will step down. Does that impact currencies?
Well, it certainly does. And I think really, if we look at the whole Asia component here, I think this is really quite significant. So we've got a potential stepping down of the Malaysia PM. Generally speaking, the COVID questions, the COVID uncertainties are bigger now in Asia than perhaps anywhere else in the world right now. If we look at where the virus is really key, I think it's outperformed now in terms of how it hit Latin America. Many of the countries there, of course, don't have access to vaccines in the way, of course, that we do in the West. If you look at South Korea last week, they had some of their vaccines that they had been expecting turned back. They said one of the companies didn't have the amount of vaccines for them. So COVID is a very significant concern. China, regionally, of course, is a very significant country too. So putting all these things together, Asia does appear to be on the back foot, and this is perhaps why we have this outperformance of the Japanese yen in the last day or so.
What about Afghanistan? So there's not a huge amount of market impact at the moment, but if I don't know whether I'm going too far into some analysis that just doesn't work, Jane, but could it have an impact on dollar longer term?
Yeah, you know what? I think it already has had an impact on the FX markets. Again, if we look at the best performers, it's the dollar, it's the yen, it's the Swiss franc, all safe havens. And I think if you look at Asia particularly, these questions have been running for a very long time now about what's going to happen between Taiwan, what's going to happen in the geopolitical field. If you look at a country like India, really wanting to raise the amount of trade that it does with other countries, again, this is perhaps part of the plan to really bolster allegiances in the region against perhaps a growing China. So when we have the Afghanistan question now, well, the question is, well, how far will the US be prepared to push back against China from a military perspective when it pulled out of Afghanistan? And I'm really not the person to be answering or attempting to answer that question, but that is a question that is being asked, and that is a question right now, which is making, I think, a lot of people anxious. And I think this has already been reflected in the fact that safe haven is being bought. So there's a number of factors, I think, behind the rise of the safe haven currencies this morning.
Yeah, what about cryptocurrencies, Jane? I mean, they kind of went back to the $2 trillion valuation overall.
Yeah, they have. I think that's quite a big benchmark, really, for cryptocurrencies. We have seen them perform again, and it's not just Bitcoin. We've seen a couple of the others performing really well. Now, again, it's very difficult to value these currencies. There are some technical levels on the charts which do appear to be constructive. That's something which a lot of buyers are going by. But there does appear to be that the possibility that maybe there's a little bit more scope for institutional interest, and that has been something which a lot of bulls are citing or have been citing in the last couple of weeks. So a couple of factors that they're driving these markets higher. But, we really do have to point out that there's huge scope for volatility here, and that has not gone away.
Jane, thank you so much. Jane Foley there, head of FX strategy at Rabobank, actually joining us this morning. Now, Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition continues in the next hour. Matt Miller joins me out of Berlin. Kailey Leinz will be in New York. We have a full market roundup. If you look at Chinese stocks, they're definitely hit by some of the criticism and some of the regulation over games. The other thing we're looking at, of course, is what's happening on the Delta variant, some of the resurgence of the Delta variant, which means that now futures in the U.S. are down. A lot of traders waiting to hear what Jay Powell will say on Tuesday. They're looking for clues on whether a recent string of strong economic data qualified as adequate progress for the central bank to start considering tapering stimulus. This is Bloomberg.
We went to Afghanistan 20 years ago with one mission in mind, and that was to deal with the people who attacked us on 9/11. And that mission has been successful.
It looks like the Biden administration has just failed in its execution of its own plan.
What we want to do is make sure that we as the UK pull together our international partners, our like-minded partners, so that we deal with that regime in a concerted way.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance, early edition with Francine Lacqua, Matt Miller, and Kailey Leinz.
It's 10 a.m. here in London, 11 a.m. in Berlin, 5 a.m. in New York, and 5 p.m. in Hong Kong on this Monday, August 16th. Our top stories today. The Taliban take over. They're back in control of Afghanistan's capital 2 decades after being ousted by the U.S. military. China's economy hits a speed bump. The Delta variant is the latest problem as retail sales and industrial output slow more than expected. And how will traders react? Well, geopolitical risks and growth concerns are likely to weigh on the markets at the start of the week. Now, Kailey, it's really a tale of two halves. First of all, we look at foreign policy. I just spoke to Jane Foley, who said it is having an impact on dollar. But at the same time, we had some weak economic data out of China, and that's all coupled with concern about the Delta variant.
Yeah, a lot of factors weighing on risk appetite this morning, Francine, and that was definitely evident in the Asian session overnight. Most equities were lower. Of course, you had economic data coming through as well. In Japan, the Nikkei was the big underperformer, down 1.6%. Yes, it did have GDP growth in the second quarter, but that was because consumption was going up. And that actually is a bad thing because as consumers go out, the Delta variant is spreading more, and that may lead to more restrictions being extended in places like Tokyo. And then, of course, we also got the data dump out of China. Retail sales, industrial production falling more than expected, showing just how much growth is decelerating. And then in China, you also have regulatory fears. Once again, state media talking about a crackdown in the video game sector. That weighed on the Hang Seng Tech Index. It was down 1.6%, or 2.5%, excuse me, and Tencent, a big underperformer within that, it was down about 3.5%. And as you were saying, Francine, Jane Foley talking about the impact in FX, you are seeing a bit into the safe haven Japanese yen, which is stronger against the dollar by about 0.3%. As for the picture for other U.S. assets, of course, we had the 48th record high of the year for the S&P 500 on Friday. Today, though, futures are in negative territory. We're down about 0.2% on S&P E-minis. A little bit of a bid for safety in the Treasury market as well after yields moved dramatically lower on Friday after that weaker consumer confidence data. They're moving lower once again by about a basis point this morning. The 10-year yield sitting at 1.26. It is a stronger dollar story broadly in G10 today. And then, of course, that may be part of what is weighing on crude, but elsewhere, it also is the spread of the Delta variant, what it could mean for demand. So WTI falling for a third straight day. It's trading right around 67.82 a barrel, Matt.
All right, and no mention of Bitcoin there, Kailey. We have seen cryptocurrencies rise above $2 trillion in market cap. Bitcoin is a big part of that. It was up over 48,000 this weekend. Right now it's down a little bit at 47,165. Take a look at the map here and you'll see that across Europe, equity indexes are down. And it really is a story of equity indexes. We don't see a lot of movement in currencies. We don't see a lot of movement in yields today. It is basically just a risk asset story, and you can see that we are looking at losses. I decided to look into the broader Stock 600 index and find out which sectors were falling the most. Pretty much everything was down, with the exception of a little bit of gain in real estate. The miners were the biggest losers. So metals and miners, that is the basic resources index, you can see down 1.8%. We also had retail stocks down, so you can see that index down 1.6% as well. Travel and leisure down 1.3, 1.4%. Maybe concern about the virus holding people back a little bit from making plans, maybe changing things at the margin there. And as a result, we have a sell-off across Europe, Fran.
Yeah, I was going to ask you actually, Matt. I feel like I'm on the Miller watch because of that $2 trillion overall for cryptocurrencies. And this is despite the fact that they didn't win the tax breaks that they thought they would have in the infrastructure bill.
Yeah, well, I mean, it could be partly due to geopolitical risk. Maybe investors are thinking that as these risks crank up, it's time to get into Bitcoin. It also could be an inflation play, but it's very difficult to know. And as we continue to point out, a large portion of these assets are held by a very small group of whales, right, and they can probably, wag the dog.
Yeah, probably. Now look at what else is ahead this week. 13 F filings due today for money managers with more than $100 million of U.S. traded equities. Tomorrow, the Fed Chair, Jay Powell, is said to speak at a virtual town hall event. On Wednesday, FOMC releases minutes from its last meeting. And then, of course, on Thursday, U.S. retailers Macy's and Kohl's release earnings. Finally, Friday, German Chancellor Angela Merkel visits Moscow and Ukraine, where she may discuss progress on Nord Stream 2. Now to our top story, and the Taliban are taking full control of Afghanistan 2 decades after they were ousted by the U.S. military. The militant troop moved into Kabul yesterday and took over the presidential palace. Hours earlier, the American-backed president, Ashraf Ghani, fled the country. Well, we have team coverage as the world awaits the Taliban's next move in Afghanistan. Anne-Marie Hordern is with us from Washington. Maria today is reporting from Berlin, and Enda Curran is live from Hong Kong. But let's start with Anne-Marie Hordern. Anne-Marie, how big is the backlash against the decision of President Biden to retreat at the moment?
It's swift if you look through all what the political pundits are saying in the newspapers and on television. And it's not so much that American people are against U.S. troops coming home. This has had bipartisan support politically. You could see that in polls during the Trump administration as well as in the Biden administration. But it's the fact that this has been taken, what it seems, American officials off guard, how quickly the Taliban was not able to just secure the country and the land borders, but the capital of Kabul. And you see there from Al Jazeera, we have photos of Taliban leaders going into the presidential palace with the American-backed Ashraf Ghani fleeing the country. Many are saying he's in Tajikistan now. And really what this comes down to now is just being able for these American officials to secure the airport. The embassy has now shut, and they have only the diplomatic presence at the Kabul airport, which if you've seen the scenes coming out of that airport, it is just completely chaotic. And this is not just to get foreign nationals out from the United States and other NATO allies, but also Afghanis who want to flee and do not, Francine, want to be under Taliban rule.
Anne-Marie, obviously some major geopolitical implications from the situation, but what about when it comes to domestic politics? Does this make it harder for those trillions of dollars in long-term economic spending to make their way through Congress?
This is twofold. We heard from Senate Minority Leader, the Republican Mitch McConnell, who really blasted the Biden administration, calling it a, quote, botched withdrawal out of Afghanistan. So there is going to be some pushback. It was a very critical week for the administration, and it was a very tough weekend for them. But on the other hand, Signum Global Advisors, a group of former diplomats who really guide the market on what's going on in Washington, D.C., say that there's going to be a short-term backlash, but they do not think it is going to pull the Biden administration off their long-term economic agenda, which, of course, here in Washington, D.C., there is still a lot of talk about those two infrastructure packages that we are awaiting in Congress.
Right. Well, the concern, of course, is that this becomes a breeding ground once again for terrorists and also starts a refugee crisis again, which would be a longer term, which would both be longer term issues. Anne-Marie Hordern, Bloomberg Washington correspondent, thanks very much for joining us. Let's get to Europe right now. Maria Tadeo, she is outside the CDU's headquarters here in Berlin because the idea of a refugee crisis is something that's very difficult for Germans to swallow, but really across Europe, the response has been fairly negative to this Biden policy, hasn't it?
Yes, Matt. And once again, you know, it's this perennial criticism that when it comes to the European Union, they struggle to put their own plans on the table and take that to become operational. Now, over the weekend, of course, we did see those pictures of European staff really scrambling to gather personnel out of the country. We haven't really seen anything so far that looks like a joint EU plan. And right now, it's a number of individual countries like Germany, France, Spain saying they will deploy military planes to take the remaining staff out of the country, but also local personnel that has been of help in the past years. In terms of where we go from here, the reality is, Matt, that Europe is facing what is clearly a political but also humanitarian and potentially migration crisis. And that is the message that is resonating today in the CDUs, the Christian Democrats in Germany, saying the debate now needs to switch. The war is lost. That is clear. We now need to focus in terms of what happens with the refugees, what happens with asylum seekers, and preventing this wave of migration in 2015. Again, it's very complicated to figure out what will happen from here. We don't know the exact number of people that will be expected to come into Europe, but clearly this will become a heated political issue here.
Maria, a couple of political factions in Europe have actually asked for a coalition of the willing without the U.S. to try and do something about Afghanistan. Would, Armin Laschet be one of those?
Well, I mean, what he said so far is that this needs to focus on the humanitarian aid and avoiding a repeat of the 2015 crisis. There are reports, however, Francine, that Germany is contemplating deploying troops on the ground, but that is just to secure the airport and the evacuation. President Emmanuel Macron is holding a meeting in about an hour. He's expected to speak in the afternoon. But again, in terms of what could happen forward, the reality is that over the weekend, we had very muted action from the European Union, and we haven't seen anything that looks like a joint plan from all of these countries coming together. If anything, it's just criticism that they were blindsided by the United States, but also the speed of events over the weekend.
All right, thanks very much for that, Maria Tadeo, joining us out of Berlin. Let's get over to Bloomberg's chief Asia economics correspondent, Enda Curran, in Hong Kong. So, Enda, China has, it's interesting because a lot of people will see an opportunity for China here, and a lot of people will see concerns because they've already experienced Taliban terrorism in recent months.
Well, China has given a fairly limited response so far to this. We had some comments from the Foreign Ministry's regular briefing, Matt, this afternoon, where they sent out a message that China is hoping for a peaceful transition of power, that China is willing to play a constructive role in Afghanistan going forward. They also made the point that they respect the will of the Afghan people and that the Chinese embassy is up and running, and indeed they also made the point that Chinese nationals who wanted to leave have left. So fairly stock standard diplomatic response from Beijing. They haven't gone much further than that, and they haven't elaborated. And I think that's probably the line that we should expect from Beijing over coming days. They will certainly be in a watch and wait mode to see how this plays out. It's still early days, and there's no doubt that it will have regional implications, including for China.
Well, meanwhile, Enda, we also are watching the economic data coming out of China. Retail sales, industrial production coming up short of estimates. How much of that is attributable to the Delta variant spread?
Yeah, no doubt the numbers were softer than anticipated. It does now confirm that China's economy is slowing and that more support might be needed. I guess to your point, the question is just how deep will this slowdown become, and that depends on whether or not they can control the Delta outbreak pretty quickly or not. The figures that came out of Beijing today for the infection rate are actually quite low, suggesting that the trend is certainly heading in the right direction, that the outbreak is becoming under control. And again, the sooner the outbreak is under control, the quicker the economy can get back to normal. If they cannot control the outbreak, then that will obviously mean the government pushes through with more restrictions, and that will obviously hurt the consumer and the broader China recovery story. So it's one to watch in the months ahead.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Bloomberg's Enda Curran in Hong Kong. And those fears around a growth deceleration in China are weighing on copper today, and that in turn is weighing on shares of miners and materials-related stocks in pre-market trading here in the U.S., one of them being Freeport-McMoRan. It is lower by about 2 percentage points before the opening bell. To the upside, though, we do have a number of movers. Matt Miller was talking about the gains we are seeing in Bitcoin north of $47,000, and that is adding some crypto-related stocks to weight this morning. Bit Digital being one of them. It is up about 6.3%. And finally, one other stock moving to the upside is Sonos, the speakers maker. It won its first round in its patent battle against Google, and that actually resulted in an upgrade over at Jefferies. The analyst there saying that ruling does help the case for this company upgrading those shares to a buy, and as a result, that stock is up about 13.6% before the bell, Francine.
Sonos, the only way to drown out kids crying. Coming up next, we'll have plenty more on Afghanistan with Ashley Jackson, Overseas Development Institute co-director. And then a little bit later, we'll be talking China with Keyu Jin, London School of Economics professor. This is Bloomberg.
We are trying to talk to the Taliban leaders in a peaceful, brotherly, and patriotic way to solve the problems of Afghanistan.
This is manifestly not Saigon.
What we want to do is make sure that we as the UK pull together our international partners are like-minded partners so that we deal with that regime in a concerted way.
It's quite clear that the Taliban have won this war. They took 20 years to do it, and they have proven that their strategy of patience will outlast the United States.
This disaster, the catastrophe that we're watching unfold right now across Afghanistan did not have to happen.
Various leaders there responding to the situation in Afghanistan. Joining us for more on what's going on is Ashley Jackson, co-director of the Center for the Study of Armed Groups at the Overseas Development Institute. She also recently published her book, Negotiating Survival, Civilian Insurgent Relations in Afghanistan. Ashley, I guess the first questions to ask are what happens now in terms of a refugee crisis, in terms of harboring terrorists? Are the concerns that we had when we went into Afghanistan now at the should they now be at the top of our list of concerns as we leave?
Sure. I think the first way to start that answer is that I don't even think the Taliban knows what's next. They swept to power faster than they anticipated, although I'm sure that they thought they would be conquering the country within a matter of months. But the real process of the Taliban now building a government actually happens. And it's really unclear. A lot of decisions, whether it's on girls' education or the presence of the few al-Qaeda left in the country, a lot of those decisions within the Taliban have been put on pause. They have effectively kicked the can down the road on these major policy decisions until basically the war is over. And I think what you will see in the coming weeks and months will be decisive on all of these issues. A major refugee crisis, absolutely. And the question is, how are European and Western countries going to deal with their moral and ethical obligations to the Afghans trying to survive, trying to escape?
Ashley, what does this also mean between, how will the Taliban actually deal with al-Qaeda?
Right. This is a question that a lot of us, myself included, have investigated since the signing of the Doha Accord between the U.S. and the Taliban, which, if you'll remember, the Taliban were obligated to make a very vague pledge, effectively like, we promise nothing bad will happen on Afghan soil. There'll be no attacks from the West. But they were not obligated to renounce links to al-Qaeda. They were not obligated to take any specific action immediately or even in the medium term. Now, U.S. intelligence assessments have said maybe there are a few hundred al-Qaeda fighters left in Afghanistan. The real concern is, will they regroup? Will they see the Taliban's rise to power as an open door? And will the Taliban welcome them in? Now, there are indications from the Taliban side that they recognize that they want international legitimacy to some degree, if not from the U.S., from powers like Russia and China, who would look down on the Taliban welcoming these groups in. So, I don't know. It really depends. I don't think it's in the Taliban's interest, and I think there are those within the Taliban who are juggling pressure to renounce these groups, which would be unpopular with their rank and file, with the political realities of they have to show that they're serious about this.
How could the Taliban be managed by the international community, Ashley?
Yeah, this is a good question. The thing is, last time around in the 1990s, and after 2001, the international community profoundly underestimated the Taliban, miscalculated, and did not deal with them effectively, was not able to exert enough international pressure to engage with them strategically. They are now a fact of life in Afghanistan. And if, for example, Western governments were to renounce the Taliban or cut aid, now remember, 80% of the Afghan budget for the government is aid. Now, if there were significant cuts, if there's another pariah state in Afghanistan, it's not the Taliban who suffers most. It's ordinary Afghans, women and children, who desperately need that aid, who need help.
Ashley, thank you so much for all of your comments. Ashley Jackson, they're co-director of the Center for the Study of Armed Groups at the ODI. We'll have plenty more on that story shortly. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Kailey Leinz in New York with Francine Lacqua in London and Matt Miller in Berlin. Now let's get the first word news. And as we've been reporting, the Taliban are taking full control of Afghanistan 2 decades after they were ousted by the U.S. military. The militant troop moved into Kabul yesterday and overtook the presidential palace. Hours earlier, the American-backed president had fled the country. Meanwhile, chaos reigned at Kabul's international airport today. Thousands of people rushed to exit the country, and according to Reuters, at least 5 people were killed as people tried to forcibly enter planes that were departing. In Haiti, the death toll from that massive 7.2 magnitude earthquake is almost 1,300 after the quake flattened homes and businesses. The U.S. deployed search and rescue teams to help find survivors trapped in the rubble. Meanwhile, Tropical Storm Grace is set to hit Haiti today. And Saudi Aramco is in advanced talks for what could be a $25 billion deal. Bloomberg's learned Aramco is discussing the purchase of roughly 20% stake in Reliance Industries' oil refining and chemicals business. Reliance is backed by Indian billionaire Mukesh Ambani. An agreement on the all-stock deal could be reached within the coming weeks, Francine.
Yeah, something that we definitely need to keep an eye on. A nice Bloomberg scoop there with our Anthony DePaula. Now, coming up next, we stock markets with Valentijn Van Nieuwenhuijzen. He's NN Chief Investment Officer. We'll ask him about inflation. We'll ask him about foreign policy. And, of course, Jay Powell speaking on Tuesday. This is Bloomberg. Well, this is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London, Matt Miller in Berlin, Kailey Leinz in New York. Matt, I know you want to talk about stocks and European stocks, and looking at some of the charts, it's actually amazing the great run that the Stocks Europe 600 has had. I think it's the longest winning streak since the dot-com era.
Yeah, since 1999. In fact, we're going to show a chart a little bit later, I guess. Dan Curtis threw it together for us, and our listeners on Bloomberg Radio, London DAB, won't be able to see the chart, but what we're going to show you is just the incredible amount of winning streaks we've had. 9 days in a row, 10 days in a row of up days, and we haven't had a pullback of 5% in 135 days. So basically, what a lot of analysts are saying is the only thing this rally is missing is a little bit of a correction. Sometimes they want to see a consolidation before the market continues to march higher.
Yeah, I think also the FTSE MIB, one of the outperformers, and that is, supported by strong second quarter earnings. Kailey, the story today a little bit different, just because we're seeing concerns about lockdowns in emerging markets, especially in Asia, and then that economic news out of China.
Yeah, a lot of factors weighing on risk appetite today, Francine. That streak in Europe that you were talking about, 10 consecutive days higher, it looks like it may actually end today because the Stoxx 600 at the moment is down by around 0.5%, falling from a record high. And here in the U.S., of course, we also reached a record high on the S&P 500 on Friday, the 48th of the year. That looks like it may change come the opening bell in about 4 hours' time. We're down about 0.2% on S&P 500 futures. You were seeing a bid for safety showing up in the bond market, but yields are off the lows now. Now they're effectively unchanged, sitting at 127 right now after an 8 basis point decline on Friday on that weaker consumer confidence data. And then, as you were mentioning, Francine, we of course got that weaker economic data out of China. That is weighing on some of the industrial metals, and copper is one of them. Futures down about 1.5%. Now, with that move lower in copper, we are seeing a move to the downside in pre-market trading with some stocks that are tied to it, one of them being the miner Freeport-McMoRan. It's down by about 2%. You have U.S. Steel down as well. And then with concerns around the Delta variant also still percolating and weighing on travel stocks, you are seeing cruise lines under some pressure this morning. Both Norwegian and Carnival down around 1.5% before the bell, Matt.
All right, so we talked about the chart. Our listeners aren't going to see it, but we might as well show it to television viewers because producer Daniel Curtis went to the trouble of putting this together. Of course, that's what he does all day, so I guess it's not trouble. But here is the chart. This is showing us basically going back the S&P 500. Well, the chart that I saw went back to 1999. This looks like it's only a couple of years. But the point is, we haven't had a real consolidation. We haven't had a 5% drop in the last 135 days. Valentijn Van Nieuwenhuijzen joins us right now, CIO at NN Investment, to talk about this rally. And how much faith do you have in a rally like this? Do you expect us to see some kind of pullback?
Well, I think it's only natural to expect somewhere over the coming weeks or months to see an occasional pullback. But I think these remarkable market dynamics come only on the back of such a remarkable period in the COVID crisis that we've had last year and the amazing rebound that we've seen in economic activity. Look at what has happened to earnings. Look at what has happened to all the macro data. That's very rare to see in any year. And that's when you get this enormous resilience in markets with all policymaker support behind it. It doesn't take away the risk, of course, that there's an occasional shakeout. But still, I would say that it's probably going to be a modest one, both in time and in size. So, whether this is the perfect day or whether this is maybe on the back of the Chinese data, a start of a bit of a correction is always hard to say. But underneath, I think there's still a lot of support for the market.
So, Valentijn, a shakeout would not be some kind of taper tantrum because the Fed actually moved sooner than the market expected?
Well, I think, in the end, a taper tantrum by the Fed, a renewed escalation of COVID outside of Asia even, and potentially a persistent decline in economic activity. Those are the three risk factors. None of them, I think, are very likely to materialize in the second half of the year. So you cannot exclude it. But if you see maybe little signs of that, it might impact markets for a week or so. But I do think that the remarkable strength in the economic data, the economic earnings, and the enormous amount of ongoing policy support for markets will basically keep on supporting the rally.
But Valentijn, so what do you buy on the dip? Are there specific industry groups that you want to get involved in, or do you just buy the index?
Well, for us so far, I mean, we've been a bit more, let's say, cautious over the summer. But we are now on this sort of dippish momentum, more thinking about, first of all, top-down adding risk, which is adding a bit of global equities, getting more cautious on your treasury exposure again, and adding in high yield and credit space. There are some elements in sectors which we like. The material sector is one. Also in commodity space, we still have some exposure to oil, aluminum, and also a bit on carbon. We still also would now think that financials and tech are interesting. They might respond differently to interest rate dynamic, but we still think those sectors are attractive.
Valentijn, how does that positioning reflect your assumptions about long-term economic infrastructure package in the U.S.? And what if that doesn't happen or doesn't make its way through Congress in its current form?
Well, I think with infrastructure, of course, we've had the first part. Now we're debating the second. As always, you need to realize this is slow moving in terms of supporting the economy. It's important. It will support the economy over the coming years. But I don't think it's instrumental for determining, let's say, market appetite for the second half of the year. So I do think it is important, but it has a bit more of a medium-term perspective to it. But it does color the overall underlining, I think, support there is still from the fiscal side. And it's not only in the US, but this is probably the most dominant for market appetite.
How important is the German election, Valentijn?
Well, it's obviously very important, although I think also the outlines are sort of clear. It's not going to be delivering a massive surprise. The key factor will be whether or not there will be a government, including the Green Party. And that is, depending on where the polls sit today, not yet clear. Whether there is a surprise or not in, for example, the SDP's showing will probably determine that. But all in all, it's going to be interesting to see Germany post-Merkel, but all in all, I do expect sort of a stability from a market's perspective from the German elections.
Valentijn, I want to pivot to monetary policy. We just had a headline crossing the Bloomberg that Fed officials are weighing ending asset purchases by mid-2022. That's according to Dow Jones. What assumptions are you making about when the taper starts and ends?
Well, when it ends, we'll see. There's a long way to go. But I do think that, whether it's the FOMC minutes or Jackson Hole, that's where we're going to get really clarity on when it will start. I think the market overall expects it, to be part of the dynamics for the next 12 to 18 months in the market. It's a reason for us that we also getting a bit more cautious on the treasury market again, despite the rally on Friday after the consumer confidence data. So we do expect it to start, let's say, towards year end.
Valentijn, thank you so much. Valentijn Van Nieuwenhuijzen there, Chief Investment Officer at NN Investment Partners. Coming up, China's faulting economic recovery. More on the risks ahead with Keyu Jin, London School of Economics professor. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. You're looking live at the principal room. Coming up later on today, an exclusive interview with Instagram CEO Adam Mosseri. That's on Bloomberg Technology at 5 p.m. Eastern. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua in London, Matt Miller in Berlin, Kailey Leinz in New York. Now in China, economic activity slowed more than expected last month. Retail sales, industrial output, and fixed asset investments all missed forecast. Well, fresh coronavirus outbreaks are adding new risks to China's recovery, which has already been hit by floods and faltering global demand. Well, with us now to talk about China and the perspective from China is Keyu Jin, Associate Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics. Keyu, thank you as always for making time to speak to us. When you look at China and some of the data points that we actually just have talked about, how much of it is lockdowns and so that China can pick up very quickly, or how much of it is it, more sinister, deeper rooted concerns?
I think a lot of the slowdown is really structural. I don't think it's just temporary. The Delta variant, of course, it has to do with a very, very strict policy of almost, keeping zero cases. That's really not quite feasible in a globalized economy like we have today. But there are also structural downturns. There are concerns about financial stability. There's concerns about property markets. Internal consumption demand has been weak because of uncertainty, because actually the pandemic has really hit hard a large portion of the lower income households. And so we're seeing that reflected in the data.
I mean, the PBOC has put moves in place to reduce some of the funding that was predicted by analysts to try and stabilize the economy and also boost growth. Do you worry about a policy mistake coming from PBOC?
I think that there's room actually to ease monetary policy further, given the fact that there are these immediate economic growth slowdown concerns. There's also structural concerns, and we really want to shift the burden from fiscal policy back to interest rate led a market equilibrium on growing consumer credit that is healthy, healthy credit growth for robust businesses. All of that, there's substantial room for that kind of monetary easing that could really substantially boost the economy in the short term.
I wonder what your take is on the Afghanistan disaster and what China can do about this. Is it an opportunity, you think, for the Chinese, or should they be concerned right now?
Well, Chinese policies surround, balancing its geopolitical concerns. I think it could be an opportunity for China. China's policy today is really to make as many friends as possible and to avoid tensions rising and to kind of spread these risks, diversify the risk around the world.
How successful has that policy been? I mean, as they push their bridges and roads policy up through Africa into the south of Europe, how successful has it been?
Well, it's been hit. The pandemic has hit everything, of course, all these plans. If we look at the data, there are, $1 trillion worth of infrastructure deficit around the world, and somebody has to fill in the gap. And China has done, to a certain extent, done some of that job in Africa and all parts of the developing world. The Going Global Belt and Road project is still very much part of China's momentous project. But of course, there has been a significant slowdown. Also, there's concerns about capital outflows. Trying to keep capital inside and trying to stimulate internal demand has been the recent focus.
Speaking of things the pandemic has hit, when it comes to trade, of course, there is still the port, the third largest container port in the world, closed partially in China because of a Delta variant case there. What implications could that have for Chinese trade?
We're concerned because of China's very strict policies and how long that will last. And that will definitely hurt Chinese trade and bring about greater uncertainty and actually probably accelerate, detracting trade and removing trade to other areas. So I think that, it's in everybody's interest to keep a looser policy around the pandemic, but it will take some time before the government will actually want to implement that.
And trade, of course, has been an area of tension between the world's two largest economies, China and the U.S. If that relationship deteriorates further, what would that do to accelerate potentially the deceleration in the Chinese economy?
Well, China has been pushing for independence, for internal economic growth drivers, technological independence, etc., because it is bracing itself for greater geopolitical uncertainty, whilst it wants to still put a priority as, creating a harmonious environment with the U.S., at least keeping as stable as possible. It is prepared. But let's not kid ourselves. China is thrived based on global economy, and the government recognizes that. So it would do at the same time promote globalization, do at its possible extent trade and financial flows, etc. Meanwhile, really pushing hard on the domestic economy.
Keyu, given Beijing's 5-year regulation plan and the fact that it is going after certain sectors, is this going to be a new China emerging, or is it just that international investors didn't quite understand what China was wanting to do?
I don't think that Chinese understood what China was wanting to do, and neither can anything really be predicted even in the next year or so. But policy reform uncertainty has been around forever. Entrepreneurs have to be skilled with these jungle surviving abilities to predict and at least be nimble enough to respond when policy changes, and that will continue. I don't think it will kill the entrepreneurial spirit. The Chinese market is so huge that you can be a very successful company, but you have to tread the line and toe the line and be in line with government policy. But that's also been true when there were industrials, commodities, manufacturing, all sorts. It was just the same thing.
Keyu, thank you so much. As always, Keyu Jin there, Associate Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics. Now, coming up a little bit later today, we'll be speaking with Eurasia's Group China Director, Michael Herson. That's at 4:30 p.m. in New York, 9:30 p.m. in London, and this is Bloomberg.
This is manifestly not Saigon. The fact of the matter is this. We went to Afghanistan 20 years ago with one mission in mind, and that was to deal with the people who attacked us on 9/11. And that mission has been successful.
Failed in its execution of its own plan. It looks like they're now trying to get folks out. This reminds me of when we've seen previous administrations allow embassies to be overrun. It's starting to feel that way. It also looks like there's a bit of panic having to reinsert soldiers to get them out. The plan should have been, much like we had, was that we would have an orderly, conditions-based way to think about how to draw down our forces there. We actually delivered on that promise.
Well, that was the former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and the current Secretary of State Antony Blinken discussing Afghanistan over the weekend. So we'll have plenty more on Afghanistan. Tom, I'm sure a great student of foreign affairs looking at Afghanistan, looking at the read across also into safe havens, including yen and dollar, Tom.
It has been an eventful weekend in New York and down to Washington. The nation transfixed, Francine, by what we see. We're going to have wonderful coverage on this. We want to continue to look at the market. So let me show a chart away from Afghanistan and all the news flow that we're seeing there. Thank you to Bloomberg and the wonderful coverage we're centering now out of Mumbai. And very simply, this is the wall of money. This is overnight repo, maybe not all that big, going through 1 trillion nicely over the weekend, Francine. We've been working all weekend, Francine, to give perspective to what we see in Afghanistan, and we will have with us Richard Haas of the Council on Foreign Relations. Ambassador Haas has had an extraordinary essay, sharply critical of Trump, sharply critical of Biden, and we are thrilled later on this morning to give you Thomas Barfield, who is a definitive scholar in America on Afghanistan.
I'll be looking forward to hearing what they had to say, Tom, about, what to do now. I mean, you can point the finger of blame all you like,
yes.
But there's a horrible situation for millions of Afghans, as well as obviously everyone else who's living in the country right now. What happens now?
Well, what happens now is within the crisis, and we're seeing the videos out on Twitter and others of absolute chaos at the Kabul airport. But, Matt, what I would suggest is to redefine the new Taliban versus the old Taliban. I'm seeing a number of treatments on that. And then it's basically to look at the adjacencies. And the one adjacency I'm focused on is China.
Tom, what about domestically here in the U.S.? What position does this put the Biden administration in?
Oh, I think they're working minute by minute, Kailey. I don't think there's any mincing of words on that. The media will drive forward that conversation with the people. But certainly what President Biden is banking on are the polls that he's seen, his administration has seen, of the unpopularity of the Afghan effort.
All right, Tom, thank you so much. We're
Sure.
looking forward to coverage, full coverage on Bloomberg Surveillance, Tom Keene and the team. Now, here is what else we're watching today. And Kailey, you're all over 13F filings.
Yeah, I am, Francine. Of course, this afternoon is the deadline for any money managers with over $100 million in U.S. traded equities to disclose their holdings to the SEC. And it's always just interesting, Matt, to get a read on how hedge funds are positioning, how they were positioned at least in the second quarter, what they're buying, what they're selling, where they're long and short. It's just a really good read as to where some of the biggest money managers out there are putting their money. So I'll be watching as we get all of those trickling out throughout the afternoon, Matt.
I mean, to some extent, it is kind of backward looking, but I always look forward to these as well. It's like a beach read that you can't put down. It's kind of gossipy. I like it. And I'll be definitely sure to check out those stories when they cross. I'm watching, what happens now in Afghanistan, because it really is reminiscent of the situation we're watching now, what we saw in Saigon, and to some extent, my concern is what we saw in Benghazi. You need to get people out of there as quickly as possible, but it's not just about the U.S. military, the U.S. State Department officials, the U.S. Contractors, but also all of the Afghan people who worked with us, even indirectly, because when you invade a country and occupy a country and make a deal with these people, we're going to help you out. You can't just leave them high and dry all of a sudden, especially when they're targets to the insurgency that's taking over. So I'll be watching very closely.
Yeah. I think, Matt, that's one of the things that they were talking about yesterday, right? These accelerating visas to get people out also of Afghan citizenship. And I have to say,
could have thought of that before.
Pictures.
Should have thought of that before we left, right? Maybe?
The videos, maybe. I mean, yes, 100%. Certainly we could have. But the videos of what you're seeing in Kabul airport at the moment, with people also holding on to planes that are taking off, I have to say, absolutely haunting.
Horrible.
What I'm looking at is Hong Kong looking at travel curbs. They put an extra 16 nations on the travel curb list because of the Delta variant. So we'll see exactly how that shapes out. But certainly this actually included the US, France, and Spain. And it's less than 2 months after it started easing some of the world's strictest quarantine measures. We have a great, I don't know if you guys have played around actually with the Bloomberg virtual interactive story that we had, where if you want to go somewhere, you can kind of put that place and see how easy it is to travel and how easy is it to get around once you've arrived at destination.
I haven't. I like my Bloomberg stories to have a black background and yellow letters. And I don't want anything else other than that. So I just look at straight up Bloomberg stories.
All right, I'll send you the interactive one and we can discuss it tomorrow. More Bloomberg Surveillance is coming up ahead. We'll hear from Richard Haas of the Council on Foreign Relations. This is Bloomberg.